Picture this. It is somewhere around 50,000 years ago. Your group has been moving for 3 days, following a herd of reindeer across open steppe in what will eventually become southern France. The temperature is somewhere between uncomfortable and medically concerning. Everyone is tired. Everyone is hungry. The two experienced hunters at the front of the group are reading the terrain with the focused attention of people whose caloric survival depends on not making errors. The elder at the back is managing her own pace carefully, conserving energy, watching the group's rear. And then from the middle of the group comes a sound that cuts through the wind, the footsteps, the low murmur of adult conversation, and the general ambient noise of 20 people moving across open ground. A baby has started crying, not fussing, not making the low, manageable sounds of mild discomfort that every parent learns to categorize and respond to with calibrated urgency. Full, committed, carrying infant crying. The kind that, in a modern apartment building, generates noise complaints and sympathetic texts from neighbors. The kind that, in the open landscape of the Ice Age, with predators whose hearing is vastly superior to the humans trying to avoid them, and with prey animals that will scatter at the sound of anything alarming in their vicinity, is not merely a parenting challenge. It is a group survival problem. Everyone in the group knows this. The mother knows this. The baby, operating on the basis of several months of experience and a nervous system that has not yet been briefed on the geopolitical situation, does not know this and would not care if it did. The baby has needs. The baby is communicating those needs through the only channel available. The baby is doing exactly what evolution designed it to do, and the people around it have, between them, the accumulated knowledge of thousands of generations of human parents who had to solve exactly this problem. How to respond to a crying infant quickly, effectively, and reliably enough that the group could keep moving, keep quiet, and not attract the attention of anything that might make the day dramatically worse. So the question worth spending real time on is this. How did ancient humans actually stop babies from crying? Not in the modern sense of sleep training methods and white noise machines and pediatric advice columns. In the deep, practical, survival stakes sense of what ancient parents actually did, what worked, why it worked, and what those strategies reveal about the relationship between ancient human biology, infant neurology, and the social structures that made raising children in dangerous environments possible at all. The answer is simultaneously older than humanity in some dimensions and more sophisticated than most people expect in others. Start with why babies cry, because understanding the function of infant crying in an evolutionary context is the foundation everything else rests on. Crying is not a design flaw. It is not something that would have been selected against over the course of human evolution. Crying is a highly effective communication signal produced by an organism that has no other reliable mechanism for communicating its needs to the caregivers on whom its survival is completely dependent. Human infants are, at birth and for a substantial period afterward, more helpless than the newborns of almost any other mammal species. A foal stands and walks within hours of birth. A wildebeest calf can run with the herd within days. A human infant cannot hold its own head up for weeks, cannot sit independently for months, and cannot walk or feed itself for the better part of a year. This extraordinary helplessness is a direct consequence of the same evolutionary pressure that produced the large human brain. Specifically, the conflict between the size of the human skull required to house that brain at birth and the size of the human pelvis required to allow bipedal walking. The human infant is born at a developmental stage that, by the standards of other primates, is premature. Its brain at birth is only about a quarter of its eventual adult size, and the majority of neural development that in other primates occurs before birth occurs in humans in the first years after birth. The human infant arrives in the world incompletely developed because arriving any later would make birth mechanically impossible. The consequence of this, extended external development, is an infant that is completely dependent on caregivers for warmth, nutrition, protection, and physical positioning for a far longer period than other primate infants. And the primary mechanism by which that infant communicates its needs, its sole reliable signaling system, is vocalization, crying. The evolutionary logic of infant crying is straightforward. An infant whose crying effectively communicated need and prompted caregiver response was an infant that got fed, warmed, protected, and repositioned when something was wrong. An infant whose crying did not effectively communicate need or did not prompt response was an infant at elevated risk of not surviving to reproduce. Over evolutionary time, the crying signal was refined into something highly effective at eliciting caregiver response, which is to say it was refined into something that caregivers find very difficult to ignore, that creates urgency and discomfort in the listener, and that does not easily habituate away. The fact that infant crying is so difficult to ignore or tune out is not a coincidence. It is the entire point. For ancient parents, this created a situation that was simultaneously biologically ancient and practically acute. The infant's need to communicate was real, and the crying signal was the appropriate response to that need. The group's need for quiet, in situations where noise attracted predators or disrupted hunting, was equally real. These two needs were in direct conflict, and the resolution of that conflict was not, and could not be, simply suppressing the infant's signal. The resolution had to come from meeting the needs that were driving the signal quickly enough and reliably enough that the signal stopped being necessary. This is where the ancient approach to infant care diverges most dramatically from many of the assumptions embedded in some strands of modern childcare philosophy. The model of infants left to cry for extended periods, or placed in separate sleeping spaces and expected to self-regulate, is an extraordinarily recent development in historical terms and has essentially no precedent in the deep ancient human past. Ancient infant care, as far as it can be reconstructed from anthropological study of contemporary foraging communities and from the physical evidence of ancient archaeological sites, was characterized by continuous physical contact, immediate response to distress signals, and the constant proximity of caregivers, not as a parenting philosophy in the ideological sense, but as a practical necessity in an environment where an unresponsive infant was a vulnerable infant. Continuous physical contact was the first and most fundamental strategy. Ancient infants were carried, not placed in a separate sleeping surface, not left in a sheltered location while caregivers worked nearby, but carried on the body of the mother or another group member in a position of physical contact that provided warmth, movement, and the sensory input of another body's heartbeat and breathing. The evidence for this comes from multiple directions simultaneously. The hip morphology of ancient human females shows adaptations consistent with carrying infants on the hip across extended periods. The design of the infant nervous system shows specific responses to conditions of being carried. The calming response associated with being held and moved is measurable in infant physiology, producing reductions in heart rate, reductions in motor activity, and state changes toward calm or sleep that occur reliably when the conditions of being carried are met. This calming response is not learned. It is not conditioned through repeated exposure. It is present from birth, appears to be innate, and operates through neurological pathways that researchers are still mapping, but that appear to involve vestibular system stimulation, the sensory system that detects movement and position, interacting with the autonomic nervous system to produce parasympathetic activation and reduction of the stress response. When an infant is picked up and held against a moving body, the vestibular stimulation of that movement activates calming mechanisms that are built into the infant nervous system at a level that precedes learning and precedes individual experience. Ancient parents discovered this not through neurological research, but through the direct, immediate feedback of infant behavior. Picking up a crying infant and moving with it worked. It worked consistently enough, across enough babies, across enough generations, that it became the default response. Not because ancient parents theorized about vestibular neurology, but because they were responding to observable outcomes. The baby stopped crying when held and moved. So you held the baby and moved with it. This is how parenting knowledge has always worked, which is to say, through accumulated empirical observation rather than theoretical framework. The specific way infants were carried in ancient contexts also matters for understanding the calming effect. Skin-to-skin contact, carrying an infant against bare skin rather than through layers of textile, provides thermal regulation, the sensory input of skin contact, and the specific signals of the caregiver's heartbeat and breathing that the infant's nervous system appears to use as regulatory references. Infants carried against a caregiver's chest with skin contact show more stable temperature regulation, more regular breathing patterns, and more consistent sleep-wake cycling than infants placed in thermally controlled but contact-absent environments. The ancient carrying arrangement provided all of these simultaneously: warmth, movement, sound, smell, touch, in a sensory package that the infant nervous system responds to as the signal that everything is safe and adequately provided for. Breastfeeding as an immediate response to infant distress is another strategy whose effectiveness precedes any parenting philosophy and operates through straightforward biological mechanisms. Nursing provides caloric input to an organism whose primary distress triggers are hunger and the consequences of hunger: low blood glucose, the physical discomfort of an empty stomach, the metabolic urgency of an organism that cannot store significant energy reserves and needs continuous caloric input to support the rapid growth and neural development of the first year of life. Ancient mothers nursing on demand responding to infant distress signals with immediate breastfeeding rather than waiting for scheduled feeding intervals. We're meeting the most immediate caloric needs of an organism with a high caloric demand, and essentially no capacity to wait patiently for needs to be met. The sucking action itself has calming effects independent of caloric delivery. Infants exhibit what researchers call non-nutritive sucking behavior in the absence of milk flow, that produces measurable calming effects through mechanisms that appear to involve endogenous opioid release and the activation of oral sensory pathways connected to parasympathetic regulation. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Ancient parents who offered sucking opportunities to distressed infants through nursing, through fingers, through whatever appropriate alternatives were available, were accessing a calming mechanism that works independently of hunger resolution. The soothing effect of sucking is one of the most ancient and most reliable tools in the infant calming toolkit, operating through neurobiology that has not changed measurably across the timescales relevant to this discussion. The role of other group members in ancient infant care represents one of the most significant and most structurally important dimensions of this story. Modern parenting in many developed world contexts is characterized by a nuclear family model in which infant care falls primarily to the mother, secondarily to the co-parenting partner, and to paid professionals in the childcare sector. This model has essentially no precedent in ancient human social organization. Ancient infants were cared for by networks of individuals, mothers, grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and other group members who participated in holding, carrying, soothing, and entertaining infants as a normal part of group life rather than as exceptional assistants to a primary caregiver working in relative isolation. This alloparenting model, care by individuals other than the biological parents, had direct consequences for infant crying as a practical challenge. A distressed infant in an ancient group had access to multiple potential responders, meaning the probability of rapid response to distress signals was higher than in a model where response depended on a single caregiver's availability and capacity. The load of continuous infant soothing was distributed across multiple individuals, reducing the fatigue and responsiveness degradation that occurs in sole caregivers managing continuous infant needs. And the range of soothing techniques available to the group collectively exceeded what any individual caregiver possessed, drawing on the experience of multiple people across different stages of parenting experience. The grandmother contribution to infant soothing in ancient groups deserves specific mention, because it reflects the broader pattern of experienced older women contributing knowledge and capacity to infant survival that has been extensively documented in anthropological literature. Grandmothers in ancient groups had the accumulated experience of having successfully raised children. They had seen what worked, what did not, what specific infant behaviors indicated which specific needs, and what responses produced reliable calming across the different types of distress an infant could experience. This experiential knowledge was transmitted through direct participation in infant care alongside the biological mother, through observation and instruction, and through the particular confidence of someone who had navigated infant care before and knew that the current crisis, however acute it seemed, was manageable. Beyond carrying, nursing, and the distribution of caregiving across the group, ancient parents appear to have used sound as a deliberate soothing tool in ways that connect directly to both the neurological responses of infants and the universal cross-cultural patterns that appear in infant-directed singing and vocalization. Lullabies. Infant-directed singing with specific acoustic characteristics including slower tempo, higher pitch, and melodic contour that differs systematically from speech appear in every human culture that has been studied. Their universality is not coincidence. The acoustic features of infant-directed singing appear to be specifically effective at engaging the infant's auditory attention and promoting calming, and the cross-cultural consistency of these features suggests they are tracking something about infant auditory processing that is consistent across the species rather rather than varying with cultural tradition. Ancient parents singing to distressed infants were accessing a calming mechanism whose effectiveness preceded any understanding of why it worked. It worked because the infant nervous system responds to the specific acoustic profile of infant-directed vocalization in ways that promote attention, reduce arousal, and facilitate the state transitions toward calm or sleep that caregivers were seeking. The song did not need to be culturally transmitted or formally composed. It needed to have the right acoustic characteristics: slow, melodic, high-pitched, rhythmically regular, and the human voice naturally moves toward those characteristics when adults address infants, in a phenomenon that researchers have documented across dozens of languages and cultures. Rhythmic movement combined with vocalization produced a compound soothing effect that was greater than either alone. The vestibular stimulation of being carried and swayed while hearing a soft, rhythmic vocal sound simultaneously engaged multiple calming pathways in the infant nervous system. Ancient parents, rocking, swaying, and walking with infants while quietly vocalizing were deploying a two-channel soothing strategy that modern infant research confirms as among the most effective available. The combination is not sophisticated in the sense of requiring specialized knowledge. It is what a human adult naturally does with a distressed infant when responding to the distress with the primary goal of making it stop. The body finds the approach that works, and across the entire human species, the approach that works is remarkably consistent. The specific survival context of the Ice Age introduces dimensions of the infant crying problem that modern parenting does not face, and that shaped ancient responses in ways worth examining directly. The scenario at the opening of this video, a crying infant during a group hunt or migration, was not a rare edge case in ancient life. It was a recurring practical challenge with real stakes. Ancient groups developed responses to this challenge that went beyond simply soothing the individual infant and extended to the social organization of how groups moved and how infant care was managed during activities that required group quiet. The positioning of infant carriers within the group during movement appears, based on archaeological evidence and analogy with contemporary foraging communities, to have been socially organized. Infants and their primary caregivers were not placed at the front of a moving group, where predators might be encountered first and where the need for alert, unencumbered movement was highest. They were positioned toward the center of the group, surrounded by other adults who could assist with both infant calming and group protection simultaneously. This positioning reduced the probability that a crying infant would be the first thing a predator encountered, and it maximized the number of experienced caregivers within immediate response distance of the infant when distress occurred. The use of plant-derived preparations to calm distressed infants in ancient contexts is an area where the evidence is indirect, but the cross-cultural consistency is suggestive. Numerous traditional cultures with ancient roots use plant preparations, teas, diluted preparations, topical applications, with mildly sedating or calming properties in infant care contexts. The specific plants vary by region and available flora, but the pattern of using botanical resources to manage infant distress appears across geographically and culturally distant communities in ways that suggest the practice has deep roots. Whether this constitutes evidence of ancient use before civilization is impossible to confirm definitively from current evidence, but the behavioral logic is consistent with what we know of ancient human use of plant resources, which was extensive, sophisticated, and included the identification of plants with specific physiological effects through careful observation across many generations. The sleeping arrangement dimension of ancient infant care is directly relevant to nighttime crying, which in any era represents a particular challenge because of the specific sleep state the caregiver is being asked to respond from, and because nighttime infant distress in ancient contexts carried the additional concern of the nocturnal predator landscape. Ancient infants slept in physical contact with caregivers as a matter of course, co-sleeping, in the modern terminology, though the ancient version was simply the default sleeping arrangement rather than a deliberate parenting choice made in the context of alternatives. Co-sleeping in physical contact provides the infant with continuous sensory monitoring of the caregiver's state. The infant can detect the caregiver's breathing, movement, body temperature, and arousal level through direct physical contact in ways that are not possible at a distance. Infants co-sleeping with caregivers show more stable physiological state, more regular breathing, more stable temperature, fewer arousal events, than infants sleeping in separate sleeping surfaces. The continuous sensory input from the co-sleeping caregiver appears to function as a regulatory scaffold that the infant's own immature regulatory systems can reference and synchronize with, reducing the probability of the distress events that produce crying in the first place. When nighttime distress did occur, the co-sleeping arrangement allowed immediate response without the caregiver fully waking. Experienced breastfeeding mothers often respond to infant nursing cues from a semi-conscious state, providing the caloric and comfort response that the infant needs while minimizing the sleep disruption to the caregiver. The efficiency of this response, rapid, requiring minimal arousal, available across the entire night, was not a design choice in any deliberate sense. It was the natural consequence of an arrangement where infant and caregiver were in immediate physical proximity throughout the night. Ancient fathers and other male group members contributed to infant soothing in ways that tend to be underrepresented in discussions that focus primarily on maternal care. The physical characteristics of male caregivers, larger body mass providing more thermal mass during carrying, different vocal characteristics producing different auditory stimulation, different patterns of movement during carrying, appear to produce somewhat different infant responses than maternal caregiving, and infants carried by fathers or male relatives show calming patterns that are distinct from those produced by maternal carrying. Ancient groups in which multiple adults of both sexes participated. Actively in infant carrying and soothing had access to a broader range of calming inputs than groups in which infant care was exclusively maternal. The social value of successfully calming a crying infant quickly in an ancient group was not merely practical in the immediate sense, it was also reputationally significant. Ancient groups were small enough that individual competence in critical skills was visible and socially recognized. The capacity to quickly and reliably calm distressed infants was a skill that experienced caregivers demonstrated visibly in the group context, and the transmission of effective calming techniques from experienced to less experienced caregivers happened in the immediate social context of the group through observation and direct assistance during actual caregiving events rather than through any formal instruction process. This means that effective ancient infant calming techniques spread through groups through the same social learning mechanisms that spread every other form of practical knowledge in ancient communities, through observation of what experienced individuals did, through direct assistance that allowed novice caregivers to feel the techniques working in real time, and through the ongoing social feedback of group members who could observe infant states and caregiver responses and note what was effective. The broader picture that emerges from examining ancient infant care through this lens is one of a system far more sophisticated, far more socially organized, and far more biologically informed than the popular image of ancient human parenting allows for. Ancient parents were not fumbling through infant care with no resources and no knowledge. They were operating with the accumulated parenting knowledge of thousands of generations of caregivers who had successfully raised infants in conditions that were, in some dimensions, considerably more demanding than those facing modern parents. They had the continuous physical contact that infant neurology is designed for. They had immediate, on-demand nursing from caregivers whose milk supply was maintained by the continuous nursing relationship. They had the distributed caregiving network of the group, providing multiple experienced responders to infant distress. They had the vocal soothing of infant-directed singing and the vestibular soothing of continuous movement during the group's mobile daily life. They had the co-sleeping arrangement that provided regulatory scaffolding throughout the night and immediate response capability at every hour. What they did not have was the specific challenges that modern parenting creates through the removal of these ancient supports. The isolated nuclear family unit managing infant care with limited external assistance, the separate sleeping arrangements that remove the regulatory scaffolding of co-sleeping, the scheduled feeding approaches that require infants to wait for response to hunger signals, the quiet, static environments that remove the continuous movement stimulation that the infant nervous system was developed expecting. The crying that modern parents face in contemporary contexts is, in some meaningful dimensions, a product of the mismatch between what ancient infant biology expects and what modern environments provide. The ancient solutions to infant crying were effective not because they were clever workarounds to the infant's distress signal, but because they were the conditions under which the infant's nervous system had evolved to function. They worked because they were what the biology was designed for. The ancient parent in the middle of that Ice Age migration, reaching for their crying infant with the automatic, experienced competence of someone whose entire social environment had prepared them for exactly this moment. They were not doing something primitive or improvised. They were deploying the most refined, most biologically appropriate, most collectively supported infant care system that our species has ever produced, refined across time intervals that modern parenting philosophy cannot begin to approach. The baby stopped crying. The group kept moving. The reindeer were over the next ridge, and the people following them had been doing this long enough to know how it ended.